All right, here we go. So our first problem, we are finding the difference quotient, and it's on a quadratic function. Our function is f of x equals x squared minus 4x plus 5. Okay, and the difference quotient is shown, it's given to you in the problem, so you don't have to memorize it, and it's probably not even on your formula sheet. It's f of x plus h minus f of x all divided by h. Okay, so this is problem number 8 on the review that you're given. And I like to color code things here. So this f of x right here, we know what f of x is because it told us what f of x is. So we could substitute in f of x into this formula. Okay, the one thing that we don't know here is f of x plus h. So that's what we need to find. We need to find f of x plus h. Okay, so in order to find that, we need to know what it means. This means in f, everywhere you see x, everywhere that there's an x, you're going to write x plus h. Okay, so in f, this is f, that's our function f. Everywhere we see an x, we don't write x. Instead, we write x plus h. So this is going to be, right? We look in f and we see an x. We see an x right here. We write x plus h. And that x was squared. So x plus h is squared. And that is going to be minus 4. And then we see an x. We're going to write x plus h. And then we're going to have plus 5. All right. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and pause here. All right, so what we need to do is we need to simplify this. So we need to ask ourselves, well, what is x plus h squared? X plus h squared is x plus h times x plus h. All right, it's kind of nice. And then minus, well, negative 4 times x is negative 4x. Negative 4 times h is negative 4h. And then we have plus 5. Lot of simplifying. We're going to have x times x and we're going to have x times h. X times x is x squared. X times h is xh. H times x, well, that's also xh. Doesn't matter the order that you write your multiplication. And then we have h times h is h squared. And then the rest of it, there's no simplifying because there's no like terms. It's minus 4x minus 4h plus 5. There are some like terms overall. Here we have x plus h and x plus h. That's 2xh plus h squared minus 4x minus 4h plus 5. Okay, this right here is f of x plus h. So when we go up to our formula, okay, in fact, we're going to move it up there. We're going to move it up there. We're going to move this up because this was f of x plus h. There, I'm going to put it right where x plus h is. We're going to replace it. We're going to replace f of x plus h. So we're replacing f of x plus h with x squared plus 2xh plus h squared minus 4x minus 4h plus 5. And we're replacing f of x with x squared minus 4x plus 5. So we're just going to clear some space here and do that. And I'm going to color code it. So in green, I'm going to write f of x plus h. So we get x squared plus 2xh plus h squared minus 4x minus 4h plus 5. And in red, we're going to do minus, and then f of x is just x squared minus 4x plus 5. And then because of the formula, we have divided by h. Okay, I'm going to pause here, see if there are Zoom. So now all we need to do is simplify. We need to distribute the negative and then combine like terms. So we're going to have x squared plus 2xh plus h squared minus 4x minus 4h plus 5 minus x squared plus 4x minus 5, all divided by h. Now, in the difference quotient, things will always cancel. X squared minus X squared will always cancel. Well, negative 4X and positive 4X cancel. Positive 5 and negative 5 cancel. All that we are left with now is 2xh plus h squared minus 4h all divided by h. The last step is to distribute your division. So it's going to be 2xh divided by h plus h squared divided by h minus 4h divided by h. And then we're going to cancel. H cancels with h cancels with h squared is really h times h. And so one of the h's on top cancels with one of the h's on the bottom. And our answer is going to be 2x plus h minus 4. That's our answer, and that's how we enter it in my math lab. Okay, so I'm going to pause the recording here. That's our answer. All right, so we have followed the steps for graphing the rational function, okay? And there's quite a few steps that are given in my math lab. We're going to go through them all, okay? Very important. So perfect. The first one. Follow the steps for graphing if needed. First, write the given function as a singular expression. So the first thing we want to do is we want to factor this thing. We want to factor this. So we have f of x equals x squared plus 5x minus 24 divided by x minus 8. So what we're going to do to factor the top, you need two numbers that multiply to negative 24 and add to 5, okay? And look, you can just follow you can look at all of the numbers that multiply. So 1 times 24 is 24. And it has to be negative. So if you're multiplying to a negative, one of them has to be negative and the other has to be positive. And since we're adding to a positive, the bigger one has to be positive and the smaller one has to be negative. So if we do negative 1 plus 24, we get 23. And we have negative 2 and positive 12. Negative 2 times positive 12 is negative 24. And negative 2 plus 12 is positive 10. Okay, so obviously, if you're already really good at factoring, you will have an intuition of to where this is going. So we've got negative 3 and 8. Negative 3 times 8 is negative 24. And when you add them, you get positive 5. Okay, so this is a good factoring technique that always works. And because a equals 1, you can use the shortcut. Here's the shortcut. X minus 3 times x plus 8. So our function, when it is factored, looks like this, x minus 8. Now, that is what we would put in A. Part A, we would write this out for part, and we'd select A. So you have to select the box A, or the multiple choice A, and then you'd have to put this in. Nothing cancels, okay? But the second question they ask, so we'll separate them into questions that they ask. There's 1, there's 2. We're going to do the first 3. The second question they ask is, what is the domain of R of X? Okay, and of course I put f of X because it's almost always f of X, but. Okay, and so let me post that. I'm going to post once again I'm going to post the review here, and hopefully we had one student say that they could access it. So if you click on that, in fact, if you click on it, as long as you're logged in with your Ivy Tech account, you should be able to access that. So that is the review that we're going over today. And this review matches the midterm exam fairly closely. Number 20 on your midterm exam will be graphing a rational function. Just like number 20 on the review is graphing a rational function, okay? The rational function is going to be different. but the steps that you need to know will be the same. Okay. All right, so we got to find domain. How do we find the domain of a function? Well, anytime it's a rational function, what you have to make sure is the denominator can't be 0. So in our function, the denominator is x minus 8. Well, x minus 8 can't equal 0. So we're going to add 8 on both sides. We're going to get x cannot be 8. Okay, so we're going to select box A for our answer because it says x cannot equal, and then we're just going to put 8 in that box. Okay. All right. Let's pause here. We're actually, let's go one further. We're going to go one further. Write the r of x in lowest terms. Okay. And our function, after we factor it, so we factor it in part A, then it's already in lowest terms. What we mean by lowest terms is nothing cancels. Nothing cancels. Okay. When you take your exam, you have paper, you have pencil, write everything out because you will be graded for partial credit. You will be graded for partial credit. Okay. All right. Let's pause here. Let's take questions. All right, so here we're working on number 20 on the review. The next set of questions says find the intercepts of the graph. Okay, so we're finding the intercepts. Anytime we want to find x-intercepts, that's when y is 0. So y, right, that's f of x is 0. So on the left side, we're going to plug in 0. And the right side, we're going to have x minus 3, x plus 8, and divided by x minus 8. Okay. Now, you can always remember too that, okay, no. We're just going to show this every step. I lied. We want to get rid of division by x minus 8. So we're going to multiply both sides of the equation by x minus 8. What happens always on the left side? It's going to be 0 times x minus 8 or 0 times something, which is always 0. And then on the right side, it's going to cancel. X minus 8 cancels with x minus 8. And we're left with x minus 3 times x plus 8. And then all we need to do is set each multiple equal to 0. So either x minus 3 equals 0, or, well, the other one is or x plus 8 equals 0. And I got a little ahead of myself. Now we can solve each one. So solve it. We get x equals 3. X equals 3 is a x-intercept. Subtract 8, subtract 8. X equals negative 8 is an x-intercept. Okay. Now, to find the y-intercept, we're going to scroll up. Finding the y-intercept is really nice. To find the y-intercept happens when x equals 0. The y-intercept happens when x equals 0. That's f of 0. So what is f of 0? Everywhere we see x, we write 0. It's going to be 0 minus 3 times 0 plus 8 divided by 0 minus 8. So it's going to be negative 3 times 8 divided by negative 8. And you can always use a calculator. I'm never against calculators, but 8 divided by 8 is 1. So it's negative 3 divided by negative 1, which is positive 3. Okay. So this is where we have to select the correct one. We have, and I'll write it down here. The y-intercept is y equals 3. We have 2 x-intercepts and we have 1 y-intercept. So the first one says the graph has y-intercept and x-intercepts. A is what we want to choose. Okay. B says there are no y-intercepts. That's totally wrong. And C says there are no x-intercepts. That's totally wrong. So we're choosing A in this case. And the y-intercept, we're going to write 3. And then we're going to write, for the next one, those are the x-intercepts. That's 3 and negative 8. Okay. That's how we're going to write our answer into my math lab. All right, let's pause here. Now what we're going to do, it says determine the behavior of the graph at the intercepts. So select the correct choice. If necessary, fill it in. So the graph will cross, okay? So this is where we talk about the multiplicity. The multiplicity is the exponent where we got our 0 from, or our vertical asymptote. The exponent here is 1. All of them are 1. So if the multiplicity is 1, and this goes back to the polynomials. If the multiplicity is odd, which ours is, we say that it crosses. And if the multiplicity is even, so odd means cross. Let's do it that way. Odd means cross. Yeah, I'm saying that right. Odd. Yeah, that's all right. Questions, comments, concerns? Even means we touch. Okay. So both of our zeros, both of our x-intercepts. So, and this is, I think, I forget who brought it up. Kemi brought it up. These are not fun to like look at and read. We have two x-intercepts and they both cross. So we're looking for where they say they both cross. So when it says the graph will cross at x equals and touch, but not cross at x equals, that's not true. Ours never touches. Ours never touches. Ours always crosses. The graph will touch, but not cross. No, ours always crosses. The graph will cross at, so that's where we do it. The graph will cross at x equals 3 and -8. And this is how we know. If the multiplicity is odd, it crosses. If the multiplicity is even, it touches. The multiplicity is the exponent on the factor. The exponent on the factor. All right, let's pause here. We're going to take questions and we're going to finish this problem up. All right, so now we're going to do the same exact thing, but we're doing it with the asymptotes. We're doing it with the asymptotes. So the asymptote here is the problem with the domain. So anytime you want a vertical asymptote, you set the denominator equal to 0. So here we're going to have x minus 8 equals 0. Add 8, add 8. X equals 8 is the vertical asymptote. So when it says the function has one vertical asymptote, that's the one we select, and the vertical asymptote is at 8. Okay, it's at 8. And then we look at the multiplicity. Well, what's the multiplicity of that asymptote? The multiplicity is 1 because the exponent is 1. 1 is odd, which means it's going to cross. And what do we mean by cross? Cross means it'll go from -infinity to infinity. Because we can show what it looks like graphically, but this is how we're going to do it for the answer. So we want to select that it approaches -infinity on one side and infinity on the other. That's the one we want to select. So, but A looks like there's two separate ones. B is wrong. Let's see what C says. Hold on. Can I paste this again? I'm going to paste this again. Wait. Did I paste it? Hold on. Paste. There we go. So let me paste it again because I think I didn't. There we go. We'll move it up here. So, oh, we did the one vertical asymptote, right? So we're looking. Oh, this is getting confusing. Here we go. We're looking down here, right? Should we paste it one more time? Okay, there, we pasted enough. We're looking down here where it says it approaches -infinity on one side and the other. C is what we want to answer. It's all right. So we know this is not the best way probably to do it because, this is very confusing. It can't be A because there's only one asymptote. And then B says, well, they're both -infinity or they're both infinity, which is like touching, right? Because if you're touching, you go from infinity back up to infinity or -infinity back down to infinity. So the crossing is going to be when it goes to infinity one side, -infinity on the other is like a cross. So we're going to write x equals 8 for our answer there. All right, let's pause here. That's very confusing. All right. So and we can put the factored form, although So we copied the next parts of the problem here over x minus 8. So what we're going to do now is it says determine the horizontal asymptotes. So a horizontal asymptote happens when the degree of the numerator is less than or equal to the degree of the denominator. That's when we have a horizontal asymptote. In this case, and degree stands for the highest power of x. In ours, the highest power of x in the numerator is 2. The highest power of x in the denominator is 1. So 1 is not less than or equal to 2 is not less than or equal to 1. There is no horizontal asymptote, so we will select C. There is no horizontal asymptote. What we have is an oblique asymptote. That happens when the degree of the numerator is greater than the degree of the denominator, okay? And look, the function's only going to have one. The function only is ever going to have one oblique asymptote. How do we find it? We can find it using synthetic division. We're going to use synthetic division from the numerator. So the numerator, we write out the coefficients. It's going to be 1, 5, and -2. And then the denominator, we pretend that that's a 0. So we put in not -8, we put in +8, right? Because if x minus 8 is a factor, then x equals 8 is a 0. And when we're using synthetic division, we put in the 0. You also can use polynomial division for this. Polynomial division will take a very slightly more amount of time, but only very slightly. In polynomial division, we always bring down the first number. So we bring down the 1. 8 times 1 is 8. And then we do 5 plus 8 is 13. And then 8 times 13, I don't know, it's some big number, right? Because it doesn't matter what we get in the end. All we care about are these first two numbers. Okay, and this is where we got to be careful too. It says write it as an equation. So this used to be the coefficient of x squared. This used to be the coefficient of x. When we change it, when we use synthetic division, this is now x, and that's all by itself. So our equation is going to be y equals 1x plus 13, 1x plus 13. And the way we write that in the homework and the test is y equals x plus 13. That's how we're going to write the asymptote. All right, let's pause it here. We're going to pause it here, see if there's questions.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So instead of using synthetic division, we can use polynomial division. So in polynomial division, the numerator goes inside the box and the denominator goes on the outside. So if we want some steps to polynomial division, the steps is you take the first term on the inside divided by the first term. Well, this is on the inside. The first term on the outside. Okay, that's our first step. First term on the inside is x squared. So we're going to take x squared and we're going to divide it by the first term on the outside, which is x. X squared divided by x is x. So we put the x on top. Then we're going to distribute to the outside. So we take this x and we multiply it by x. X times x is x squared. And then we get x times -8 is -8x. And then the third thing we do is change the signs. Change the signs. This is a positive x squared. We're going to change it to be a negative x squared. This is a negative 8x. We're going to change it to be a positive 8x. And then we add. So x squared minus x squared is 0. 5x plus 8x is 13x. And then we bring down the -2. And then we repeat the process until we can't do it anymore. So what's the process? First term on the inside divided by first term on the outside. 13x divided by x is 13. So we're going to put plus 13 on the outside. Then we distribute. -13 times x is 13x. I don't know what I just said, but let me repeat it. 13 times x is 13x. 13 times -8. All right. I'm going to cheat and use a calculator. It's not cheating. You can use a calculator the entire time, but it's going to be minus 104. What do we do next? It's very important. We change the sign of each term. The first term was positive, we make it negative. The second term is negative, we make it positive. Then we add. 13x minus 13x cancels. We get 104 minus 2 is 102. Then we try to do it again. But when we try to do it again, the first term on the inside is 102. Well, what's 102 divided by x? We cannot do 102 divided by x, so we know that we're done. We know that we're done. And what's our answer? Our answer is going to be y equals whatever's on top. So y equals x plus 13. All right, let's pause here. All right, so the next step that we're looking at is right here. Determine the points, if any, at which the graph intersects the horizontal or oblique asymptotes. So what is our horizontal asymptote? Well, it's not horizontal, it's oblique. It was x plus 3. So we want to know, does x plus 3 ever touch our graph? Well, what's our graph? Our graph is x squared minus, we're going very up to the very beginning, and it wasn't minus, it's x squared plus 5x minus 2 divided by x minus 8. Okay. How do we solve this? How do we solve this? Well, we have to multiply both sides by x minus 8. Get rid of that division first. X minus 8 cancels with x minus 8 on the right side. On the left side, we gotta, am I recording? On the left side, yes, we are. On the left side, we got to distribute. So x times x is x squared. X times 13 is 13x. So we did that one. And then -8 times x is -8x. And then -8 times 13 is 204. All right. The only reason I know that is because wait, is it 204 or 104? It's only 104. The only reason I know that is because we just did it on the polynomial division problem. Is that equal to x squared plus 5x minus 2? Well, we can combine like terms, so it's going to be x squared plus 5x minus 104. Is that equal to x squared plus 5x minus 2? Well, this is a quadratic. How do we solve quadratics? Set one side equal to 0. So we're going to subtract 2x. Sorry, we're going to subtract x squared. We're going to subtract 5x, and we're going to add 2. We're doing that so we get, on the right side, we get 0. So we got to subtract x squared, subtract 5x, and add 2. What do we end up with? We end up with 102. Is 102 equal to 0? The answer is no. So we would say that it does not intersect. So, wait. The graph intersects. No, the graph has no point that it intersects. C is what we want to answer for that one. Now, what I should have said also is if you go up to the previous problem, when you do polynomial division, if you have a remainder, they do not intersect. If you have a remainder, they do not intersect. If your wait, am I lying to you? You always have a remainder. I'm lying. The only way that you can do it is the way that I just showed. However, your question 20 will be a lot like the question 20 that we just did on your midterm exam. What does that mean? That means most likely on your question 20 that it's not going to intersect. That's what that means. All right. I could be wrong because I don't know what the midterm exam says. I could be wrong. You should try it this way. You should try it this way. All right. Perfect. So next, we're going to finish this one up. The next question is, use the real zeros in the numerator and denominator to divide the axis into intervals. Okay. Determine where the graph is above and below. So this is a sign chart. We're going to take which is the function is f of x equals, see, it was x minus 3 times x plus 8 divided by x minus 8. And this is a while back, but the zeros from the top are 3 and negative 8, and the vertical asymptote was 8. When you're doing a sign chart, always start with negative infinity, then go to the next smallest value, which is negative 8. Then you go to 3, then you go to 8, then you go to infinity. Okay, and then draw a line down from the middle of that number. And on the left side, put all your factors. So you have x minus 3, you have x plus 8, and you have x minus 8. All right, and then at the end, we're always going to put f of x. And then you can just pick numbers. Pick numbers in the interval. So a number in the interval. So these stand for intervals. It's the interval from negative infinity to negative 8. So negative 10 is a number in that interval. And then from negative 8 to 3, you have 0 is a number in that interval. You also could have chose 2 or 1 or negative 3 or negative 5 because they're all in that interval. You just have to pick one number in that interval. Interval between 3 and 8 is going to be 5. And then 8 to infinity is going to be 10. And then just plug them in for x. If x is negative 10, negative 10 minus 3 is negative. Negative 10 plus 8 is negative. Negative 10 minus 8 is negative 18, that's negative. A negative times a negative times a negative is negative. 0 minus 3 is negative. 0 plus 8 is positive. 0 minus 8 is negative. 5 minus 3 is positive. 5 plus 8 is positive. 5 minus 8 is negative. Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have put that. We'll talk about the last one next. 10 minus 3 is positive. 10 plus 8 is positive, and 10 minus 8 is positive. They're all three positive. Now, if you have an odd number of negatives, all you're looking at are negatives. If you have an odd number of negatives, in the first one, we have 3 negatives. A negative times a negative times a negative is negative. A negative, if you have an even number of negatives, then it's going to be positive. A negative times a negative is positive. And then just one negative is negative, all positives is positive. So when it asks us, it's below, and I'm sorry, we're going to wrap up right here. It's below the x-axis if you get a negative. So from negative infinity to negative 8, we're below. And then from 3 to 8, we're also below. So we're going to put union 3 to 8. We're below the x-axis. When are we above the x-axis? From negative 8 to 3, and from union 8 to infinity. Okay, so that's what we would put. It's sometimes above and sometimes below. So B is the one that we're going to answer. And the intervals that we put in are right here. The intervals that we put in are right here. Okay. All right. So I know I'm not 100% done with this one, but I am going to finish this one. But I want to make sure that everyone opportunity to fill out the survey for this. So let me know, fill out the survey. Let me know how I did. Let others know how I did too. And let us know what more you would like to see. And we only covered 2 problems. So one thing I would have liked to see is more problems. But I do want to say too, we have another review session on Monday and we have another review session on Tuesday. We do not cover the same problems. I'm going to email those let them know that we covered number 8 and number 20. The one good part about covering number 20 is that it covers number 19 as well. 19 and 20 are the same problem type. We covered it 2 for 1. Okay. All right. The last question here is to graph this. So our graph had an asymptote. The asymptote was at x equals 8. So if you're looking at these graphs, the ones that it absolutely can't be is A, because the asymptote is negative. On B, the asymptote is also negative. C is the only C and D are the only possibilities. Okay. But if we look at our sign chart, at the end of our sign chart, we are supposed to be above the x-axis. We're supposed to be above. This C has us being above the x-axis. So C is going to be our correct answer for that, for graphing it. Okay. All right, I'm going to pause here